I'm going to ask everybody if you have a question, you can drop it in the chat. Okay, I see a lot of thank yous. I see a lot of thank yous. I do have a question. So I have seen you speak at length in different podcasts, and I was wondering if you could give us maybe an abbreviated version of, the relationship between 1776 and US fascism today. Is that like too long of a conversation for us to answer the next like 20 minutes or no? And we do have other questions.
I can give you the executive summary. The executive summary being that you may have noticed that during the course of my remarks, I used this phrase class collaboration. That is to say, I said that the enslaved Africans did not engage in class collaboration. And in fact, despite many of our friends on the left affixing what they consider to be the insult of identity politics to describe what is actually a descending version of class solidarity amongst enslaved Africans. That's why the descendants of the enslaved Africans tend to vote against the right at a higher rate than any other demographic, oftentimes 8-2 or 9-1, as expressed in the most recent election this past Tuesday. However, class collaboration has been at the essence of settler colonialism. If you look at my book on the 16th century, for example, and you look at my telling the story of the 1580s, when England first sent colonists across the Atlantic to try to occupy what they call North Carolina, it was a typical class collaborationist project. That is to say, poor Europeans, along with the 1% in London, uniting across class lines for mutual benefit, i.e. seizing the land from the Native Americans and ultimately stocking it with the free labor of enslaved Africans. If you look at January 6, 2021, the attempted coup, once again, class collaboration, mostly people of your descendants of settlers of European descent, including CEOs flying in on private planes, shopkeepers, military veterans, simple workers, etc. So if fascism does arrive in the United States, it will arrive being buoyed and born by class collaboration. That is to say, the kind of class collaboration you saw on January 6, 2021, the kind of class collaboration you saw in the 1580s in what London called North Carolina. And I'm afraid to say that major victims of fascism will be the community that oftentimes shuns class collaboration, speaking of the Black community, which is continuing to express and exude a kind of class solidarity, particularly in trying to repel the incursions of the neo-fascists and the right wing.
Thank you. I do see some questions here. One from Tamasha. Do you want to ask it out loud?
I think Dr. Horne already just covered it about class collaboration among insurrectionists on January 6th, but I am typing out another question about what happens when there is collaboration with, I try not to sound like hyperbolic, but contemporary acts of fascism when we look at police violence toward Black and Indigenous and other communities of color. What are we seeing when we see Black and Indigenous and other people of color participating in those groups that are acting out state-sponsored violence on their own communities? That one kind of leaves me at a loss. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, as the example of Clarence Thomas on the US Supreme Court, amongst others, tends to suggest, class solidarity is not universal. It's not existing at the level of 100% amongst the melanin rich, amongst the descendants of enslaved Africans. This too is nothing new. If you look at the history of slave revolts, Gabriel's revolt in Virginia in 1800, It was basically betrayed by other Negroes. Ditto for Denmark Vesey's attempted uprising in South Carolina about 200 years ago, betrayed by other Negroes. So this is nothing new. And in fact, you may suspect, understandably, that that kind of betrayal, that kind of turning one's back on class solidarity will increase during the 21st century unless and until we are able to create organizations and resistance that discourages that kind of betrayal and class collaboration. But once again, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the political expressions in the Black community are a result of history, that is to say, being descendants of an enslaved population, which routinely engaged in class solidarity, and also an expression of today's reality, where there is a recognition that class solidarity is very important in terms of trying to lessen the terror that is routinely inflicted upon the Black community in the first instance.
Thank you. We have Nina next. Nina, I can read yours out loud, or you can read it yourself.
Well, I'm happy to speak, and apologies for being off camera. I'm kind of running back and forth between my office and the kitchen to feed the cats. Cats have to be taken care of while I do my learning. So the question, Dr. Horne, and I have read parts of your book, the Counter-Revolution book, and from other scholarship. I'm a legal scholar myself, so I'm familiar with the Somerset case. I'm familiar with, because most legitimate legal scholars recognize that it had a strong role in influencing the Southern colonies in particular, in joining the Northern colonies and challenging, England and the British Empire and engaging in civil war. So I'm familiar with that, but I'm less familiar with the Royal Proclamation. I don't recall that being spoken about as much in the book. If you could just maybe provide a little explanation of the 1862-1863 Royal Proclamation and then its influence on sort of the evolution of making to 1776. That would be super helpful.
Yes, the Royal Proclamation of 1762, 1763. And before I get to that, let me advert to the point you made about feeding your cats, because it ties into a contemporary point. You may have noticed that the latest fable about the ultra-right wing, which led to a victory in Oklahoma for the man who was going to oversee education, is that children, this is meant as a slur on the trans community, that children are now identifying as cats, and that they're asking for litter boxes to be placed in classrooms. Believe it or not, the person who is going to be administering education in the state of Oklahoma used that theme, apparently, to win. And I think that this bespeaks the kind of hysteria that's gripping the United States of America, the kind of defamation that's gripping the United States of America. And hysteria and defamation oftentimes go hand in hand with the rise of neo-fascism. Now, with regard to the Royal Proclamation, what happens is that London was expending blood and treasure, fighting Native Americans as the settlers were moving west across the continent. London had its hands full fighting on the European continent. It had its hands full contesting and contending with its perpetual antagonists across the Channel, speaking of France. So it was willing to try to cut deals with the indigenous population. Native American scholars, by the way, such as Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, are making a big deal about this Royal Proclamation. And of course, this is followed when London fundamentally tries to overthrow the United States in 1812, where London was fighting shoulder to shoulder with many Native American groupings against the settlers, including the great warrior Tecumseh, who died during the War of 1812, fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Redcoats. So this is part of the newer vision or revisioning of the early history of the United States of America. And I'm happy to say that more writers and scholars are joining this movement, which I think bodes well for the future of this country.
Thank you, sir.
Gio, you want to ask your question out loud, or you want Sierra to read it, or one of us to read it?
I'm happy to ask it out loud. Thank you for inviting me, and very nice to meet you, Dr. Horne. My question is, it's also in the Zoom chat as well. In the age of, quote, Black celebrities type a sentence online and undo the progress of Black revolutionaries sometimes within a week of publicity, end quote, how do we overcome this betrayal and continue building the movement for self-determination for Black people in solidarity with the Native American struggle? I kind of heard you touch upon some elements of this earlier.
Well, solidarity with the Native American struggle is going to be critical. And once again, that requires a revisioning of history. In my latest book on Texas, which covers the slavery period and the post-slavery period, I point to this contradiction in Black America during the post-slavery period. Whereas on the one hand, in East Texas, and by the way, Texas has the largest Black population in the United States of America, for reasons I can go into if you're interested. But in East Texas, post-1865, you had a reign of terror inflicted upon the Black population. Texas was also always in the vanguard in terms of lynching, extrajudicial, extra-legal executions of Black people without due process of law. However, in West Texas, you had Black soldiers, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers, who were at the tip of the spear when Native American resistance was crushed. And I think that if we're going to talk about revisioning US history, we're going to have to revisit the inglorious history of the Buffalo Soldiers and the inglorious history of how Black soldiers, Black male soldiers for the most part, if not exclusively, were involved in human rights violations against indigenous populations. And I think that that's important for a number of reasons, not only because I think solidarity is built upon truth and honesty, but also it should come as no shock or surprise that today even there might be a tendency erupting of using one targeted group against another targeted group, which is basically what happened post-1865 in the US Southwest. So that's my brief response to your question. And certainly, I think that for the Native American population and for the Black population, and by the way, the Cherokee are now negotiating to have one of their treaties implemented, which would grant them non-voting representation in the US Congress today, tomorrow. And perhaps if we begin to look at the other treaties that were negotiated with indigenous groupings, we'll find similar kinds of provisos, which would then allow for certain kinds of alliances on Capitol Hill between the Congressional Black Caucus, whose numbers are growing, and the Native American representation, whose numbers may be in the process of growing.
Thank you very much. And I'm also going to review the literary references as well. Thank you again.
Mm-hmm.
Lise, do you want to say your question out loud?
Yeah, sure. Nice to meet you, Dr. Horne. So my question follows up actually on Gio's question. And I was wondering if you have any recommendations on how organizers can be proactive in protecting their movements from those betrayals, especially when organizing virtually and it's harder to build trust the way you might have. And, so even though folks were able to be in person and build deeper trust, there was still a lot of potential for betrayal. What are your recommendations for us now in this virtual space?
Well, that's a very difficult question because, as I'm sure you know, COVID has not disappeared. In fact, it's been complemented, so to speak, by flu and other opportunistic viruses, which makes it very difficult. But that makes it very difficult for us to come together under one roof. But having said that, I do think that I would like to see a revival of a trend that was quite prevalent when I had less gray hair than I do today. And that trend, of course, was study groups. I was able to come to maturity at a time when people considered themselves to be revolutionary. Many people in my generation then considered themselves to be students of world politics, not just students of US politics. So therefore, we studied incessantly. There were collectives that came together to read various works and then discuss face to face. Perhaps if that were to happen today, you would discuss it like this, but still, I don't think my voice is muffled. So I think you could probably still understand me. And likewise, I think that what we tried to do was engage in mutual solidarity. That is to say that we had Native American groupings who were joining picket lines in support of the Black liberation struggle and vice versa. You had a Black Panther Party that was complemented by the Brown Berets from the Chicano movement, the Mexican American movement. You had solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Indochina. It's one of the reasons why that war came to a screeching halt in 1975. So I think that the ultimate answer to your question is the ultimate answer to many questions, which is that we need to accelerate study and we need to accelerate organizing.
Thank you so much.
Nia, I saw that you had your hand raised.
I put it back down and I see that Charles has a question in the chat.
Okay, Charles, would you like to answer your question out loud, or would you like it to read it for you?
Sure, I can go ahead and read it. And I apologize if it's a little bit uninformed, but I'm just wondering, Dr. Horne, if you can speak to the role that the music plays in moving us forward, meaning Black American music. The types of exploitation that you spoke about in Jazz and Justice persists. And even through platforms like Spotify, the jazz scene or the mainstream jazz scene is perhaps whitewashed. Yet it still feels like Black American music contains a blueprint for struggle and is a form of study. And I just wonder if you could speak to us about that.
Well, thank you for the question. Charles Wallace Thomas IV is referring to my book, Jazz and Justice, Racism and the Political Economy of the Music, which was published a few years ago. It's an attempt, among other things, to show how music was helping to propel mass movements at a certain point. I won't rehearse or repeat all the examples that I cite in that book. Let me also say that at a certain point, musicians' unions were very important, just like unions generally are very important. One of the deficits in my remarks thus far has not been emphasizing and stressing the role of unions, organizations of working class people coming together for mutual solidarity and mutual benefit. That happened as well with regard to jazz musicians. That also involved not only coming together for mutual benefit in unions, It also meant musicians contributing their art and their skill to mass movement. You're probably familiar with the work of the late, great Max Roach, who, by the way, spent some of his latter years teaching at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Some years ago, he was involved in fundraising activity on behalf of anti-Jim Crow movements. The same could be said for the late, great pianist, bassist, composer, Charles Mingus. In fact, if you look at my book on Southern Africa, one of the themes that will leap out from the pages of that text is how, in building solidarity with the movement in Southern Africa, we had, speaking of activists on this side of the Atlantic, we had substantial support from musicians, not only musicians like Abdullah Ibrahim, the late Dalla Brand, who of course was of South African origin, but all sorts of musicians in the United States of America, particularly Black American musicians, but not exclusively Black American musicians. So music has an important role to play, and given the fact that the Berkeley School of Music is within stone's throw, I imagine, of where some of you are sitting, it gives even more reason for Bostonians and Bay Staters to be joining hands with musicians for mutual solidarity and mutual benefit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gerald Horne. I hope everybody gives a round of applause. Thank you so much for sharing with us and for speaking with us. This has been such an